There comes a moment in every avoidance life when silence stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like punishment. For the longest time, they thought distance was safety, that pulling back was protection. They built walls so high that not even love could climb over them, and for a while it worked. They stayed in control, unbothered, untouchable. But then, something unexpected happened. Someone genuine came into their life. Someone patient, kind, and brave enough to stay even when the avoidant kept pushing them away. That person wasn't perfect, but they saw through the layers. They saw the fear beneath the aloofness, the softness hidden behind the sarcasm, the longing masked by independence. They tried not to fix, but to understand. They offered love without demand. They offered safety without control. But when even that love wasn't enough to make the avoidant open up, something changed. Not in the one who stayed, but in the one who pushed away. Because when the right person finally walks away, the avoidant feels something they've been running from all along, the ache of what they lost, not because they were unloved, but because they couldn't let themselves be loved. Suddenly, the silence that once felt comforting becomes unbearable. The space that once felt like freedom becomes a haunting emptiness. Every moment alone starts to echo with the memory of what could have been if they had just chosen vulnerability over fear. You see, love doesn't always teach through staying. Sometimes love teaches through leaving. The right person walking away is often the mirror that finally makes the avoidant face themselves. It's in that heartbreak they realize no one can outrun emotional connection forever. At some point, the cost of avoidance becomes heavier than the fear of being hurt. And maybe, for the first time, they begin to understand that intimacy isn't about losing yourself, it's about finally being seen as who you are. It's not weakness to need someone, it's not dependency to desire closeness, it's human. The avoidant starts to change when they realize that the person who walked away wasn't trying to take their freedom, they were trying to share their peace. And when that person is gone, the avoidant finally feels the difference between solitude and loneliness. That's when transformation begins, not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly. The next time someone new shows them care, they might hesitate before pushing it away. The next time they feel love creeping in, they might stay still long enough to let it touch them. Because now they know what it feels like to lose something real, not because love failed them, but because fear did. When the right person walks away, the avoidant doesn't just lose a partner, they lose their excuse. They can no longer hide behind "I'm just not emotional," or "I don't do attachment." Because now they've met someone who showed them what love could have been, if only they were brave enough to let it in. And that's the irony: the avoidant changes the most after the right person is gone. Not because they want to win them back, but because they finally understand what they pushed away. That realization doesn't erase the pain, but it plants a seed. A seed that says, next time I'll stay a little longer. Next time I'll listen instead of withdraw. Next time I won't let love slip through my fingers because I was too afraid to hold it. Sometimes walking away isn't an ending. It's the beginning of someone else's awakening. Distance feels safe until it costs you connection. For the avoidant, emotional distance is not just a choice. It's a survival mechanism, a way to feel in control when everything else feels unpredictable. They build walls not to reject love, but to regulate the fear of losing it. From a young age, they learned that closeness often led to disappointment, that vulnerability was a liability, and that needing someone was a weakness. So they crafted a life of emotional autonomy, mistaking independence for peace. When someone comes along who genuinely cares, they start to feel exposed. Every act of kindness, every expression of affection, feels like pressure. Their instinct is to retreat, to protect themselves from what they interpret as a threat to their stability. They create space because space feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. But safety and fulfillment rarely coexist in the same emotional space. The avoidant doesn't realize this until the person who once filled that space begins to fade. The texts come less often, the warmth in the voice cools, and the presence that once felt steady starts to drift. At first, the avoidant convinces themselves that it's fine. They tell themselves that they need the break, that the quiet feels good. They interpret the growing silence as relief, because silence has always been their comfort zone. Yet over time, the relief starts to feel hollow. The space that once offered control now feels empty. The absence begins to echo. That's the cruel paradox of avoidance. It protects you from pain only until it becomes the very source of it. The avoidant learns this truth when they look around and realize there's no one left to care whether they withdraw or not. The distance that once made them feel powerful now isolates them. They start to miss the laughter that used to fill the silence, the messages that reminded them they were thought of, and the emotional closeness that once felt overwhelming but now feels irreplaceable. What once felt like peace becomes punishment, and what once felt like strength reveals itself as fear. In that quiet reckoning, the avoidant starts to understand that connection was never the threat, it was the medicine. They realize that the right person didn't try to cage them, they tried to meet them where they were. But every time the avoidant pulled back, the other person had to choose between chasing and self-respect. Eventually, the right person chooses themselves, leaving behind a void the avoidant can no longer ignore. That loss becomes a mirror, showing them the price of distance, the relationships that could have been deeper, the moments that could have been shared, the love that could have been real. The painful irony is that avoidants often crave the very closeness they reject. They want to be seen, loved, and understood, but they don't know how to stay in the warmth without fearing the burn. It's only when that warmth is gone that they understand how much it meant. The illusion of safety shatters, revealing a simple but devastating truth. Distance doesn't keep them safe, it keeps them alone, and in that loneliness, they begin to feel the cost of every wall they ever built. Love doesn't always teach through staying. Sometimes the deepest lessons arrive only after love has left the room. For the avoidant, this realization doesn't come gently. It comes like an emotional aftershock, sudden and disorienting. When the right person finally walks away, it's not just the loss of companionship they feel, but the loss of a mirror that once reflected their hidden softness. The avoidant often doesn't understand the magnitude of someone's presence until it becomes an absence, until the phone no longer lights up, until their silence is no longer a choice but a consequence. That's when love begins to teach, not with comfort, but with clarity. When love stays, the avoidant can hide behind their defenses. They can tell themselves they don't need too much, that space is healthy, that independence is the ultimate form of control. But when love leaves, the illusion breaks. The avoidant begins to see how their emotional distance, once seen as strength, was actually fear dressed in logic. They start to realize that the one who walked away didn't do so out of impatience, but out of exhaustion, from constantly reaching for someone who wouldn't reach back. The loss becomes a lesson written in silence. You can only push someone who cares so far before they stop trying. In the aftermath, the avoidant begins to replay memories differently. They remember the moments when their partner tried to connect, when they opened up vulnerable conversations, when they offered affection that was met with hesitation or withdrawal. What once felt like overattentiveness now feels like devotion. What once felt like suffocation now feels like warmth. And in this reversal, the avoidant begins to see the truth, that love wasn't trying to take something away from them. It was trying to give something they were too scared to receive. The beauty and pain of love's departure lie in its ability to expose what the avoidant refused to face while love was still present. It dismantles the stories they told themselves, that caring too much makes you weak, that people always leave, that needing someone guarantees disappointment. But when love truly walks away, and no one is left to chase them or hold space for their distance, the avoidant feels something they haven't allowed themselves to feel in years: grief, not just for the person they lost, but for the version of themselves that never learned how to stay open when love called their name. That grief becomes the beginning of growth. The avoidant may not rush to change, but something inside them softens. The lesson of love's absence lingers quietly in the background of their mind, whispering truths they can't unhear. They start to understand that love doesn't punish them by leaving, it teaches them. It reveals through loss what connection really meant. And though they might not admit it out loud, they begin to see that love didn't abandon them. They abandoned love first. Over time, the avoidant learns that love's greatest lessons are not taught in comfort, but in contrast. The void left behind is what finally teaches them to value presence. The silence teaches them to listen. The loneliness teaches them to reach out. Love, in its absence, becomes the most powerful teacher of all, one that doesn't speak in words, but in the aching reminder of what was once theirs to hold, and what they must learn to nurture if it ever comes again. Avoidance isn't strength, it's fear in disguise. To the avoidant, emotional distance feels like composure. They believe that by staying detached, they maintain control, dignity, and power. They tell themselves that caring too deeply leads to disappointment, that showing emotion makes them vulnerable, and that independence is the ultimate form of resilience. But beneath that calm exterior lies a heart that has learned to protect itself too well. Their strength isn't built on self-assurance, it's built on survival. It's the kind of strength that comes from a place of defense, not freedom. And though it looks like confidence on the surface, inside it's often a quiet, unspoken fear. The fear of being hurt again, of being misunderstood, of being abandoned once more. Avoidants often grew up believing that emotional expression led to rejection or shame. They learned to retreat inward, to meet their own needs silently, and to find stability in self-sufficiency. Over time, this became their identity, the one who doesn't need anyone, the one who remains calm when others fall apart. It feels empowering until love enters the picture. Love asks for connection, for vulnerability, for shared spaces that can't exist behind walls. And that's when the avoidant's so-called strength starts to tremble. They resist, not because they don't care, but because caring exposes the one part of themselves they've never learned to trust, their emotions. The irony is that the avoidant often admires people who are emotionally open. They're drawn to warmth, affection, and authenticity, yet these very qualities trigger their fears. When someone gets too close, the avoidant's instinct is to pull away. They might rationalize it by saying they need space, or that they're not ready for something serious, but beneath those excuses lies the terror of being seen too deeply. It's not that they don't want love, it's that they don't believe they can survive the vulnerability love demands. Their independence becomes a fortress built not from strength, but from the memory of pain. But true strength isn't in withdrawal, it's in courage. It's in the willingness to stay when emotions feel messy, to communicate instead of retreat, and to risk being misunderstood rather than staying silent. Avoidants often confuse calmness with control, but real emotional maturity doesn't come from suppressing feelings. It comes from learning to express them safely. The moment an avoidant starts acknowledging that their distance comes from fear, not power, is the moment healing begins. Admitting that they're scared doesn't make them weak, it makes them human. When the right person walks away, that illusion of strength begins to crack. The avoidant starts to see that their walls didn't keep them safe, they kept them lonely. They realize that bravery was never about standing alone. It was about standing open. Vulnerability, once seen as a threat, now appears as the missing piece of real connection. In that painful realization, they begin to understand that love doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for honesty. And the greatest strength an avoidant can ever show is the courage to let someone in, even when every instinct tells them to run. Transformation begins in the silence after love leaves. When the right person walks away, there is no dramatic crash, no instant awakening, just an eerie stillness that settles into the avoidance world. At first, that silence feels familiar. They've always found comfort in solitude, in the quiet control of their own emotional space. But slowly, the silence begins to change. What once felt peaceful now feels hollow. The same stillness that once represented safety starts to echo with memories, words left unsaid, and the soft ache of absence. It is in that haunting quiet that transformation quietly begins, not because the avoidant chooses it, but because the silence leaves them no choice. In the beginning, they tell themselves they're fine. They go through their routines, keep their composure, and convince themselves they've done the right thing by protecting their boundaries. They might even feel relieved for a while, free from the emotional demands that intimacy brings. But the human heart has a way of reminding us of what we've lost, even when we try to outthink it. Little things start to trigger memories: the smell of coffee in the morning, a familiar song, a quiet evening that feels too empty. It's in these small, seemingly unimportant moments that the avoidant begins to feel the weight of their own decisions. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting the truth they've spent years avoiding. They start to realize that love didn't make them feel trapped, fear did. They begin to see that emotional closeness wasn't suffocating. It was healing, but they weren't ready to accept it. For the first time, they sit with the discomfort of missing someone, not because they were dependent on them, but because that person mattered. They mattered deeply. The avoidant begins to understand that love wasn't trying to take their freedom. It was offering them connection, and in rejecting it, they only deepened their loneliness. Transformation at this stage isn't loud or visible. It doesn't look like sudden self-awareness or grand gestures of apology. It's quiet, almost invisible from the outside. It's the way they hesitate before pulling away from someone new. It's the way they begin to question their old patterns, the emotional shutdowns, the avoidance of hard conversations, the rationalization of withdrawal as self-protection. The silence teaches them what words never could, that their coping mechanisms came at a cost, and that cost was connection. Eventually, the avoidant begins to soften. The edges of their defensiveness start to blur. They may not know how to express it, but they start craving something real again. Something safe but open, structured yet vulnerable. They start to see love not as a threat, but as a space for growth. The person who once equated distance with strength now begins to understand that healing happens through closeness, not avoidance. In the quiet aftermath of love's departure, they finally start to hear themselves. The silence becomes their teacher, their guide, their first real encounter with self-awareness. And though they can't undo the past, they begin to build a future where emotional distance no longer feels like survival, but something they can finally let go of. The right person's absence plants the seed for future love. When someone truly genuine walks away from an avoidant, it doesn't just leave a void, it leaves behind a quiet awakening. That departure becomes the first real lesson in emotional accountability, a moment when the avoidant can no longer deny the impact of their patterns. The right person's love lingers even after they're gone, not as a haunting, but as a reminder of what was possible. Their kindness, patience, and emotional openness become the blueprint for what love could feel like if only the avoidant allowed themselves to receive it. In that absence, something begins to shift, something small but powerful, a seed of awareness that starts to grow in the soil of regret and reflection. At first, the avoidant doesn't recognize this change. They still feel numb, still convince themselves they did what they had to do, but the mind keeps circling back to what was lost. The warmth in that person's eyes, the softness in their voice, the consistency they offered without demand. Over time, these memories stop being background noise and become lessons. The avoidant starts to replay moments, not to blame themselves, but to understand. They start to see how often they confused space with peace, and how many times they mistook love's persistence for pressure. This introspection isn't about guilt, it's about growth. The right person's departure doesn't break them, it breaks their illusions. In that brokenness, the avoidant begins to see love differently. They begin to recognize that love doesn't threaten independence, it enriches it. They learn that emotional connection doesn't have to mean losing control. It can mean sharing it, and though they might still struggle to express it, they start craving the same authenticity that once scared them. The memory of the one who walked away becomes a quiet teacher, whispering reminders in future moments of hesitation. Don't run this time, don't retreat, don't let fear win again. The next time someone offers care, they might not push it away so quickly. The next time affection feels overwhelming, they might breathe through it instead of shutting down. Every interaction becomes a chance to do better, to show up more fully than before. This growth doesn't mean the avoidant forgets the one who left. In fact, their memory often becomes the foundation for the avoidant's emotional evolution. That person becomes a symbol of what genuine connection feels like, a benchmark for future love. The avoidant begins to understand that love isn't supposed to be perfect, it's supposed to be real. And real love requires courage, presence, and vulnerability, the very things they once feared most. The right person's absence shows them that avoidance may protect the heart temporarily, but it also starves it. In time, that seed of realization takes root and begins to grow. It pushes the avoidant toward change, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but always forward. They start opening up, not because they're no longer afraid, but because they've learned that love is worth being afraid for. The absence that once felt like punishment transforms into purpose. It teaches them that the loss of someone right isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of learning how to truly receive it. And though they may never be the same again, that's the point. The right person's absence doesn't just leave a scar, it leaves a map, guiding them toward a love they will finally be ready to keep. In the end, how the avoidant changes when the right person walks away is not just a story of loss, it's a story of awakening. It's about realizing that love isn't the enemy, fear is. That distance doesn't protect, it isolates. And that sometimes the person who walks away leaves behind the very lesson that leads us back to love. Change doesn't happen when we hold on. It happens when we finally see what we pushed away and decide to do better next time. Thank you all for listening, for feeling, and for reminding yourselves that even in heartbreak, there is growth, and even in endings, there is hope.